A few cards inside the old recipe box still carry dried sauce stains from many years ago. The edges of the paper curl upward from having once been held by hands covered in flour and kitchen grease inside homes where money always had to be divided carefully across every day of the week. These recipes were never written to impress anyone. They belonged to women who knew how to look into an almost empty kitchen cabinet and still place a hot dinner on the table before their husbands and children came home. Tonight, we open the old recipe box once again. The pot of beans had to last until Tuesday. The mother lifted the lid and stared at what remained inside a little longer than usual. She knew that tonight she would have to add water, add onions, maybe even add rice. Not to make the meal taste better, but to make it last for one more dinner. In many American kitchens of the early 1950s, dinner did not begin with the question, "What are we eating?" It began with the question, "How much is left?" One can of tomatoes had to become enough sauce for the whole family, and the bacon grease stored inside the coffee can beside the stove was sometimes the thing that kept the house smelling like hot food at the end of the day. If these old kitchens remind you of someone who once cooked for you, subscribe to the channel and stay a little longer. One dish on today's list was once considered poor people's food. Now it appears in many southern restaurants with a price higher than that of steak. And several other dishes were made almost entirely from things modern people would throw away. There were evenings when nobody asked what they wanted to eat. The real question was, what was left in the house that could be turned into dinner? In many American kitchens of the early 1950s, the paycheck often did not arrive before the weekend ended. The father was about to walk through the back door after long hours at the factory or out in the cold fields, while the mother stood in front of the kitchen cabinet looking at the leftovers, trying to figure out what the family would eat that night. Dish number 25, bread and milk. The kitchen was quiet enough to hear stale bread slowly soften inside a bowl of hot milk. Steam rose gently from the white enamel bowl sitting in the middle of the small kitchen table. In 1952, in an industrial town in Ohio, a bowl of bread and milk might cost only a few cents if the bread was already a day old. The mother tore white bread into the bowl, warmed milk in a small pot, then slowly poured it over the top before sprinkling on a little sugar if there was still enough in the house. For adults, the dish sometimes signaled that the household money was almost gone. But for children, it was still a warm bowl before bedtime. The children did not know it was poverty. Dish number 24, crackers and milk. The dry snap of crackers breaking into the cup was very soft, but inside the quiet kitchen, that sound was enough to signal that dinner was being created from whatever remained. In 1951, in many working-class families across the Midwest, crackers and milk often appeared on late-week evenings when the wallet was nearly empty. The mother broke crackers into a nail, poured milk over them, then waited just long enough for the crackers to soften without completely falling apart before handing the cup to the child sitting quietly at the dinner table. Small things like that were rarely written in cookbooks. People remembered them through their hands and through habits repeated over many years in the same kitchen. A warm cup was also a form of care. Dish number 23, canned creamed corn on toast. The smell of toasted bread meeting hot creamed corn created a kind of dinner that was both sweet and rich, with a warm yellow layer spread across the toast. In 1955, in a Midwestern farmhouse kitchen, one inexpensive can of creamed corn could be stretched across many slices of toast to feed the whole family. The mother toasted the bread until crisp, warmed the creamed corn in a small pot, then added a little salt and pepper before spooning the hot corn over the toast. Those kitchens did not have much money, but they had memory. They remembered the grease left in the pan, the ham bone after Sunday dinner, the few soft potatoes at the bottom of the basket, and the bag of dried beans hidden deep in the cabinet. That was where poor people's meals began turning into a form of survival skill. Dish number 22, fried potatoes and onions in bacon grease. The smell of onions meeting hot bacon grease could make a small kitchen feel as if there were meat on the table, even though the pan actually held only potatoes and onions. In 1953, in a farmhouse kitchen in Iowa, a few potatoes, one onion, and a little saved bacon grease could become a dinner that cost almost nothing more. The mother sliced the potatoes thin and dropped them into the hot cast iron pan. She added thinly sliced onions afterward and fried everything slowly until the edges of the potatoes turned golden while the onions softened inside the fragrant grease. A man returning home after a long day of labor might not see meat on the table, but hot potatoes and sweet onions were still enough to make the kitchen feel like a real dinner. Even without meat, there was still dinner. Dish number 21, pinto beans with cornbread. A pot of pinto beans did not begin at dinner time. It began the night before, when the mother poured dried beans into water and knew the family would need them tomorrow. In 1952, across Kentucky and Tennessee, pinto beans with cornbread were not a side dish. For many working families, that was the main dinner. She soaked the beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a ham bone or salt pork. Meanwhile, the cornbread was baked in a cast-iron pan until the top turned deep golden brown and carried a faint smoky smell. When the beans softened and the broth thickened, she broke cornbread directly into the hot bowl so the bread could soak up the salty flavor and the rich liquid underneath. A pot like that could return to the table for another day. Dried beans once kept entire families standing. Dish number 20, potato soup. On a cold evening, steam rising from a pot of potato soup fogged the windows of a small Appalachian kitchen. During the winter of 1954, potato soup was the kind of dinner that was cheap, hot, and able to feed many people with very little money. The mother cut potatoes into small pieces and cooked them until soft with onions before lightly mashing them right inside the pot. If there was still milk or a little butter left in the house, she added it at the end to make the soup smoother and thicker. Potatoes made the meal filling, onions made the kitchen smell like dinner, and the warmth from the white pot helped the house feel a little less cold at the end of the day. Even a white pot could still feed people. These meals showed that a poor kitchen not only knows how to endure, it knew how to calculate. And behind that careful calculation, there was always a woman standing there quietly, keeping the family moving forward. She did not study at a culinary school. She did not have thick cookbooks lined up on kitchen shelves or a refrigerator full of food for the entire week. But she knew exactly how far 1 pound of meat could stretch if she added rice, added onions, added tomatoes, and added thyme. In many working-class kitchens, the greatest skill was not about what meal was being cooked. It was about making everyone around the table feel as though they had eaten a real dinner. Dish number 19, stuffed peppers. Half of a bell pepper sitting in the baking dish looked like a small bowl holding hot filling inside. On the dinner table, stuffed peppers almost looked like an elaborate meal. In 1955, in a working-class kitchen in Pennsylvania, a small amount of ground beef could be stretched with rice, onions, and tomatoes to make enough filling for the whole family. The mother mixed ground beef with cooked rice, chopped onions, and canned tomatoes, then stuffed the mixture into halved peppers before placing everything into a baking dish with tomato sauce covering the bottom. When the meal was brought to the table, the first thing people noticed was the sight of full portions sitting neatly beside one another. But behind that was a very practical calculation about how to stretch a small amount of meat farther to feed more people. A little meat went farther because of her. Dish number 18, hamburger gravy with mashed potatoes. Ground beef hit the hot pan and began sizzling with onions and the thin layer of grease at the bottom of the cast-iron skillet. In 1953, throughout factory towns across the Midwest, hamburger gravy with mashed potatoes was the kind of hot, filling dinner waiting for people returning home after a long work shift. The mother cooked the beef with onions, then sprinkled flour into the meat drippings before slowly pouring in milk and stirring until the white gravy began to thicken. When spooned over hot mashed potatoes, the small amount of beef somehow seemed enough for the entire dinner table. Potatoes kept people full longer. The gravy made the kitchen smell as though the day had been properly brought to an end. Gravy knew how to stretch meat. Dish number 17, macaroni with tomatoes. A can of red tomatoes was poured into a pot of pale macaroni, and suddenly the whole dinner seemed a little brighter beneath the kitchen light at the end of the day. In 1955, 1 inexpensive can of tomatoes and 1 box of macaroni could become dinner for an entire family without needing extra meat or cheese. The mother boiled elbow macaroni, then crushed canned tomatoes into a pan with a little bacon grease, salt, and pepper before stirring everything together until the pasta became coated in a lightly tangy red sauce. The meal was very simple, but it carried one major advantage in crowded kitchens. There was enough so that every plate around the table received a portion. 1 can of tomatoes brightened the whole pot. Those women did not cook using calculations alone. They cooked with instinct. And if you listened carefully enough, a working-class kitchen always carried a sound of its own. A working-class kitchen always had a sound of its own. There was the hiss of bologna on a cast-iron skillet, the soft tap of a wooden spoon against the bottom of a pot, and the sound of the door opening when the last exhausted person finally came home after a long day. In those kitchens, the sound of dinner often arrived before the food ever reached the table. Dish number 16, fried bologna sandwiches. When the slice of bologna touched the hot pan, the center began to puff upward while the edges browned quickly in the thin layer of grease at the bottom of the skillet. In 1954, in many American working-class families, a few inexpensive slices of bologna could turn white bread into a hot dinner. The mother cut small slits into the edges of the meat before placing it onto the hot cast-iron skillet. She waited until the edges changed color and the meat became fragrant before placing it inside bread with a little yellow mustard if there was still some left in the house. For children, simply hearing the soft sizzling of bologna in the pan was enough to know that there would be something hot waiting for them that night. Cheap food could still smell like home. Dish number 15, chicken and dumplings. An old chicken simmered so long that the meat began falling away from the bones while the broth turned deep golden beneath the steam filling the kitchen. During the winter of 1952, in many southern and midwestern homes, chicken and dumplings often appeared on cold days or on days when the family needed to feel a little more cared for than usual. The mother simmered the chicken to deepen the flavor of the broth, then pulled the tender meat from the bones before dropping spoonfuls of dough into the pot. The dumplings slowly expanded inside the hot broth, making the entire pot feel fuller. This was the kind of meal that made people pull their chairs a little closer together when the weather outside began turning cold. Some meals felt like blankets inside a bowl. Dish number 14, tomato gravy with biscuits. The leftover bacon grease in the skillet was mixed with flour, then crushed canned tomatoes were poured in afterward. The sharp smell of tomatoes mixed with black pepper and hot fat created a familiar aroma in many southern kitchens. In 1953, across Alabama and Georgia, tomato gravy with biscuits could appear on the dinner table during difficult weeks when the kitchen needed a hot meal that could still feed many people. The mother stirred flour into the grease at the bottom of the skillet, then added canned tomatoes, salt, pepper, and a little sugar before simmering everything until the reddish-orange gravy began to thicken. When poured over hot biscuits, the gravy transformed the dry bread into a dinner capable of making people feel a little lighter after a long day. The skillet still held one more meal. These dishes sounded familiar, comforting, and warm. But there were other poor people's meals that would seem far stranger to modern people today, even though they were once genuine survival knowledge in many old American kitchens. Today, some dishes on this list might surprise people just by their names. But in poor kitchens during the 1950s, they appeared very naturally on the dinner table. They had purpose, nutrition, and the ability to help a family get through one more day. Dish number 13, beef liver with onions. Beef liver is a dish many modern people tend to avoid. But in many working-class families of the past, it carried a value of its own. In 1950, beef liver was often much cheaper than many other cuts of meat, yet rich in iron, protein, and vitamins, something especially important for families forced to carefully calculate every food dollar. The mother sliced the liver thin and soaked or rinsed it to soften the strong flavor before quickly frying it with onions in a hot skillet. The onions turned soft and golden very quickly, filling the kitchen with a deeper, richer smell. The most important thing with this dish was always timing. Liver cooked too long became dry and bitter. A generation that hated liver sometimes did not hate the dish itself, but the fact that it had stayed on the skillet longer than necessary. Some meals required skill to be loved. Dish number 12, scrapple. Scrapple was born from an old principle among Pennsylvania Dutch farm families. If a pig had been raised, then every edible part of it had to be carefully saved. In 1955, scrapple was a familiar cold-weather meal in kitchens shaped by generations of thrift. Meat scraps, organ meats, and broth were cooked until soft, then mixed with cornmeal or buckwheat flour before being pressed into molds to cool and firm. Afterward, The mother sliced it and fried each piece until the outside turned crisp and brown. To people outside the region, the dish might sound strange, but for families raised with it, scrapple carried memories of farms, winter, and the respect people held for the labor required to raise an entire animal. Frugality became a regional tradition. Dish number 11, wilted lettuce with hot bacon dressing. A bowl of slightly wilted lettuce sitting on the kitchen table might make modern people think it was time to throw it away, but in many old kitchens, it was still the last usable vegetable for dinner. In 1952, in homes with small backyard gardens, wilted lettuce often appeared as the final greens remaining at the end of the week. The mother placed the lettuce into a bowl, then whisked hot bacon grease with apple cider vinegar and a little sugar before pouring it directly over the leaves. Within seconds, the lettuce softened further and became coated with a lightly tangy smell and the warmth of bacon fat. Wilted never meant finished. It only needed hands that knew how to bring it back one more time. Something nearly thrown away could still become dinner. These dishes sound strange because we have moved far away from those old kitchens. But when people look at prices from that time, they begin to understand why every can of tomatoes, every bag of beans, and every loaf of bread mattered so much. Today, 12 cents can barely buy anything. But in a kitchen in 1955, a bag of dried beans, a can of tomatoes, or the ham bone left over after Sunday dinner could determine what the family would eat for the next 2 days. Those kitchens understood very well how to turn inexpensive ingredients into a pot large enough for many people gathered around the table. Dish number 10, split pea soup. Dried peas looked rather plain sitting inside a paper bag, but after many hours in hot water, they slowly began to break down, thickening the soup and transforming a simple pot into a real dinner. In 1954, one inexpensive bag of split peas could become a large pot of soup, especially if the family still had a ham bone left from an earlier meal. The mother rinsed the peas, then simmered them with onions and the ham bone for many hours. She stirred slowly until the peas almost melted into the broth and created thickness without needing cream or butter. A pot like that was often enough for the next day as well. The peas kept people full longer. The bone left behind a smoky flavor and the last traces of salt. Everything else was created through time. Time took the place of money. Dish number 9, bean soup with ham bone. The ham bone that seemed stripped of meat still remained inside the pot, continuing to release salty flavor and familiar smokiness through many hours of slow cooking. In 1951, for many American working-class families, Sunday dinner was not truly finished once the meat on the table was gone. The bone often returned inside the soup pot at the beginning of the week. The mother soaked the beans early in the day, then placed the bone into the pot before simmering everything until the broth thickened and began clinging to the spoon. In kitchens where every food dollar had to be carefully calculated, that bone still held value. It preserved the flavor of the earlier meal and stretched it one more time. An old bone could still feed people. Dish number 8, Hoppin' John. A pot of black-eyed peas, rice, and a little salt pork looked very simple beneath a kitchen light at the end of the day. But in the American South, Hoppin' John carried more than just the meaning of an inexpensive dinner. In 1950, in many Deep South families, the dish appeared often on the table because it was filling, easy to cook, and large enough to feed many people. The mother cooked black-eyed peas with onions and salt pork, then mixed them with rice so the grains could absorb the salty flavor and smoky aroma from the hot pot of beans. For many families, the meal was also tied to old beliefs about luck and the new year. Even a poor family's pot could still carry a sense of hope when everyone sat down together for dinner. Beans, rice, and a little hope. Some dishes survived because they were cheap. Others survived because of the land where they were born. And in every region of America, people found their own way to turn very little into the feeling of family. Every region in America had its own way of saying that people still knew how to place dinner on the table, even when there was not much money left in the house. Appalachia had pots of beans and cornbread. The Deep South had slow-cooked greens with salted meat. The Midwest had large casserole dishes divided with an old wooden spoon at the center of the dinner table. The ingredients changed depending on the region. The feeling remained the same. Dish number 7, pot liquor with cornbread. The smell of greens cooked slowly with salt and smoky meat still lingered in the liquid at the bottom of the pot after many hours on the stove. To many modern people, that might seem like leftover liquid, but in Southern kitchens, pot liquor was always the part most worth saving. In 1953, across the Mississippi Delta and Georgia, pot liquor with cornbread was a very familiar meal in working-class households. The mother saved the cooking liquid from the greens, then reheated it at the end of the day. She broke cornbread into a deep bowl before pouring the hot liquid over the top so the bread could absorb the salty flavor, the taste of greens, and the last traces of smoke from the salt pork. That liquid held nearly all the flavor from the large pot that had simmered throughout the afternoon. The soul lived at the bottom of the pot. Dish number 6, collard greens with ham hock. Collard greens required more time than people expected. The tough, deeply flavored leaves had to cook slowly for many hours before they finally softened and absorbed the smoky taste from the ham hock. In 1952, across Alabama and Georgia, collard greens with ham hock were both a traditional meal and a way many families stretched dinner using vegetables from the small garden behind the house. The mother washed the greens carefully, then removed the tough stems before placing the leaves into a pot with salt pork or ham hock. As the greens simmered, the kitchen gradually filled with the smoky, salty smell so closely associated with the American South. When the meal was served, the broth underneath was often used for dipping cornbread or spooning over hot rice. Even poor greens knew how to fill people up. Dish number 5, simple Midwestern casserole. An old baking dish, 1 can of cream soup, leftover noodles or potatoes from the kitchen cabinet, and a few extra vegetables from earlier in the week could become a casserole in many Midwestern kitchens during the 1950s. In 1955, this was how many families gathered scattered leftovers into one hot meal large enough to place at the center of the table. The mother mixed noodles or potatoes with canned cream soup, then added leftover vegetables before sprinkling breadcrumbs across the top and sliding the dish into the oven. When the casserole began turning lightly golden on top, the entire kitchen smelled like a dinner far larger than the actual ingredients inside. One baking dish gathered the whole week together. Those regional meals did not disappear in a single day. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to forget grandmother's dinner. They disappeared more slowly than that, at the same pace as the kitchens that once created them. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to forget grandmother's bean soup. It was simply that one day canned soup became faster. Another day, jarred sauce became more convenient. And eventually, there came a moment when nobody in the kitchen asked grandmother how to cook anymore. Those old dinners did not disappear suddenly, they left very slowly. Dish number 4, frozen dinners replacing cast iron skillets. A divided aluminum tray was placed into the oven, and little by little, the sound of cast iron skillets in the evening became less common in many American homes. As television dinners and frozen foods became more popular, dinner no longer always began with onions, flour, and a large pot on the stove. People peeled back the covering, placed the tray into the oven, waited a few minutes, then ate portions that had already been divided for them. That convenience helped many families save time and feel less exhausted after long workdays. But at the same time, certain skills slowly began to disappear from daily use. And what is no longer repeated every evening often fades very quietly. Convenience arrived gently, then stayed. Dish number 3, canned soup replacing bean soup. The sound of opening cans gradually replaced the sound of beans simmering for hours on the stove. As life moved faster, a ready-made can of soup could replace the pot that once began early in the morning with dried beans and the leftover ham bone from the weekend. People opened the can, poured the soup into a pot, added water or milk, then reheated it before serving dinner only minutes later. There was nothing wrong with that speed. But a can of soup did not teach a child how to soak beans, how to save a bone that still carried flavor, or how to recognize the moment when broth had become rich enough. Faster did not always mean more memorable. Dish number 2, recipes that said a little, just enough, and cook until it's ready. On many old recipe cards, there were sometimes no exact measurements at all, only short lines such as a little flour, add milk, or cook until it's ready. Those words only truly made sense when the person who wrote them was still standing beside the stove explaining them with her own hands. In many families, recipes were not lost because they were thrown away. They were lost because nobody remained to ask how much a little meant or what ready was supposed to feel like. Some meals were never remembered through measuring spoons or kitchen timers. They lived inside habits, memory, and the movement of hands stirring an old wooden spoon through a pot of boiling soup. Some recipes disappeared together with the hands that made them. And that is why the final dish on this list means more than a poor family dinner. It is the image of an entire older way of life, where people knew how to turn very little into enough for a whole table. Dish number 1, a pot of beans, cornbread, and the leftovers of the entire week. A pot of beans sat on the stove for many hours, the broth growing darker and thicker beneath the heat, filling the small kitchen. Beside it rested a pan of cornbread, golden along the edges and still warm in the center. In 1952, in many homes across Appalachia and the Deep South, one bag of dried beans, a little salt pork, and cornbread could feed an entire family through several dinners. The mother soaked the beans the night before, then simmered them with bones or salted meat until the broth began to thicken. She stirred the pot with an old wooden spoon before breaking hot cornbread into deep bowls for each person. This was the food of miners, farmers, and large families forced to calculate every meal carefully throughout the week. It did not need a beautiful name or an elaborate plate. It only needed to be hot enough for people to wake up the next morning and continue working. The 25 dinner dishes we have just passed through were never created to impress anyone. They were cooked from stale bread, crackers, dried beans, soft potatoes at the bottom of the basket, ham bones that still carried flavor, bacon grease saved inside coffee cans, and the small leftovers that modern kitchens often throw away very quickly. But in Grandmother's kitchen, almost everything still held value if it was used at the right moment. The old recipe box was opened at the beginning of this story. Now, it can be closed once again. The yellowed recipe cards rest quietly beneath the warm evening light, still carrying the smell of old paper, flour, and kitchen heat lingering from many years ago. But their lesson remains at the dinner table. She did not cook from abundance. She cooked from what was left, using memory, her hands, and love. Many modern people look at those meals and see only hardship. But sometimes, the people who had the least understood best how to guide their families through difficult weeks using skill, experience, and quiet daily care. Those kitchens were not perfect. They were colder during winter when the coal supply was nearly gone. They were quieter at the end of the week when the paycheck had not yet arrived. The woman of the house had to calculate every slice of bread, every spoonful of grease, and every remaining bit at the bottom of the pot before thinking about the next dinner. And yet, by the next morning or the next evening, there was still something hot waiting on the table. Maybe your family once had a meal like that too. A very simple dish whose smell still lives somewhere inside your memory. What did your family call those meals? Did your grandmother keep bacon grease inside a coffee can? Was there a poor family dish that appeared often on your dinner table but is rarely cooked anymore today? If these old dinners remind you of someone who once cooked for you, pull your chair a little closer once more. There are still many forgotten kitchens waiting to be remembered. An old kitchen never truly disappears as long as someone still remembers its smell. Pull your chair closer. Next time, we will open the recipe box once again.